Elena's voice on the phone was quiet in a way that made my stomach drop before she'd even finished the sentence. "Ma'am, don't come home. Check the cameras, right now." My hand tightened on the wheel. 2 hours earlier, I'd hugged my father goodbye at Dulles, watched him and Victoria disappear through security, their flight already climbing somewhere over the Atlantic coastline by now. Or so I thought. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, put the car in park, and opened the security app with fingers that weren't quite steady. I should explain something about myself first, because it matters for everything that came after. I'm an Army officer, 12 years and 3 deployments behind me. If there's one thing that training does to you, it's strip away the impulse to panic. You gather information first. You assess before you act. So even with my chest tight and my pulse loud in my own ears, I didn't turn the car around and race home. I sat in that parking lot and made myself watch. The feed loaded slow. For a moment there was nothing, just our house sitting quiet in the late afternoon light, the flag my father flies out front hanging still in the windless heat. Then I scrubbed backward, and a black SUV rolled into the driveway. I recognized the plate before I even registered whose car it was. Victoria's. I sat there running the math, and it refused to add up cleanly. Their flight had boarded 20 minutes ago. I'd watched them walk to the gate myself. And yet there was her SUV back in our driveway less than half an hour later. She wasn't alone. A man stepped out of the passenger side, 60 or so, dressed in a suit too formal for a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't know him. 10 years of holidays and family dinners, and I'd never once seen his face. Victoria let herself in with her own key, glancing toward the porch camera for just a second too long, before she stepped inside like she was checking whether anyone was watching. Elena told me later that Victoria had asked in passing whether the cameras still recorded to the cloud or just locally. At the time, it had seemed like an idle question. It wasn't. I called Elena back the moment they disappeared inside. She was somewhere in the house, her voice pitched low. "She came back," Elena whispered. "Told me not to worry about it. Said she forgot something." I asked where they'd gone. "Straight to my father's study," she said. "The room at the back of the house where he keeps his paperwork, the room nobody enters uninvited. Not me, not Elena. As far as I knew, not even Victoria." I switched back to the feed in time to see them cross into that room. The hallway camera caught only a sliver of it through the open door, the corner of my father's desk, a strip of wall where a landscape painting has hung since before I can remember. I watched Victoria walk toward it with a directness that told me this wasn't the first time. There's a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. It started in my chest and spread outward as I watched my stepmother lift that painting off the wall. Behind it, set into the plaster, was a safe. One I had never known existed in that house in 33 years of being my father's daughter. I called him. Straight to voicemail. His phone was likely already switched off for the flight. I tried Victoria next, some part of me still hoping there was an explanation simple enough to make me feel foolish. It rang twice and went to voicemail, too. A minute later, a text came through from my father's number. "Everything is fine. Don't worry about anything at home." I stared at the timestamp for a long moment. It had been sent nearly 40 minutes earlier, before boarding, before Victoria's car had ever turned back into our driveway. Either he'd sent it from the gate, some instinct telling him to head off my worry before he even knew what he was heading off, or someone else had sent it from his phone entirely. I didn't like either possibility. On the feed, the man crouched beside the safe while Victoria stood over his shoulder, arms crossed, checking her watch. Then the door, then the safe again. Whatever this was, it had a clock running on it. Then her voice came through the tinny audio, low but clear enough. "Richard changed the code after Caroline came home." I sat with that sentence longer than I wanted to. It meant she'd tried the code before. It meant this wasn't the first time she'd stood in that room wanting in. And it meant somehow that my presence in that house had been enough to make my own father change the locks on something I didn't even know he was hiding. I thought about my father's health lately, the fatigue he'd waved off as nothing, the doctor's appointments Victoria had started scheduling and driving him to without much explanation. I hadn't thought much of it before tonight. Now, every small thing from the last year seemed to be rearranging itself into a different shape. The man finally got the door open. He started pulling things out and laying them on the desk, a thick folder, a small wooden box dark with age and envelope. Victoria turned the envelope toward the light, and even through the grainy resolution, I caught it. My name written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize, sealed inside a safe I hadn't known existed in a house I grew up in. She opened it. Read whatever was on the single folded page inside. went still in a way that had nothing to do with the deadline she'd mentioned a moment earlier. Then she folded the page back up, slid it into her jacket, and said 4 words I would not stop hearing for days. She can't know about this. I sat in that parking lot with my own house reduced to a grainy rectangle of betrayal, and I understood with a certainty that settled cold and permanent in my chest that whatever I thought my family was, it wasn't only that. Not anymore. I didn't call the police and I didn't drive straight home. I called Reyes instead, my father's lawyer for almost 15 years, but his office had already closed for the day, so I left a message asking him to call me the moment he got in. Then I turned my attention back to the one source I actually trusted in that house. Elena picked up on the second ring, her voice still low, like she didn't want the sound carrying through the walls. I asked her a question that had been building in me since I first saw that black SUV pull into the driveway. How long has Victoria been asking about that study? She was quiet for a second. Then she told me it went back further than I'd guess. Over the last year, Victoria had asked her small things where Richard kept his important papers, whether he still used the same insurance company, whether there were any old boxes from before the marriage. A few months ago specifically, she'd asked Elena if she remembered a wooden box that used to belong to Caroline's mother. Elena had said she didn't know what Victoria meant. She hadn't been lying. She just hadn't wanted to be the one who found out. None of it had seemed like much at the time. Wives ask about paperwork. But stacked together now against a woman letting herself back into a house she was supposed to be 400 miles away from, those small questions took on a different weight entirely. I asked Elena to stay out of it, not to confront Victoria, just to keep the doors locked and stay in her own part of the house until I figured out what I was actually looking at. Back on the feed, the safe stood open, the painting leaned against the desk, and the man was still working through what he'd pulled out: the folder, the box, that envelope with my name on it. I zoomed in as far as the app allowed. Victoria's voice caught again through the audio. Richard changed the code after Caroline came home, she'd said, and I'd already turned that sentence over more times than I wanted to admit. It meant she'd tried it before. It meant my own presence in that house had triggered a change my father never told me about. The coffee maker was still running in the background of Elena's end of the call. I could hear it hiss faintly, an ordinary sound from an ordinary evening which somehow made everything happening on that camera feed feel even less real. I dug through what records I had access to that night, old emails, a few documents I'd kept from years back, things I'd never had a reason to look at closely before. What I found reshaped the last decade in my head. 10 years ago, right before my father married Victoria, my mother died. I was in the middle of officer training then, 4 states away. And by the time I made it home for the funeral, my father had already been carrying his grief alone for weeks. Victoria appeared not long after Casserole's sympathy, the quiet competence of someone who fills a gap before anyone notices it's being filled. Within a year, she was managing the bills, the insurance, the paperwork my father used to handle himself. I'd been proud of him for finding someone who took care of things. I never asked myself why he'd suddenly needed so much taking care of. What I found in the records was smaller than I expected and more real for it. My mother had held her own investment account before she passed, along with partial ownership of a small vacation property on the eastern shore my parents had bought together years before I was born. My father had continued managing both quietly after her death, the kind of thing grief makes easier to handle through paperwork than conversation. The beneficiary listed on both was me, not Victoria. If that was accurate, Victoria had no legal claim to any of it, which might explain, I thought, why she'd want to know exactly what existed, where it was, and whether it could still be redirected. Elena called back near midnight, unable to sleep, and told me one more thing she said she'd almost forgotten until tonight brought it back. A week before the wedding, my father had handed her a small wooden box and told her, "If anything ever happens to me, make sure Caroline gets this." She'd kept it safe for a while. Then one afternoon she went to check on it, and it was gone. She'd never asked Victoria directly. She admitted quietly that she'd been afraid to. I understood that fear better than I wanted to. There was something about the way Victoria ran that house, calm, competent, always one step ahead, that made people careful about what they questioned. I'd felt it myself for years without naming it. I thought about my father somewhere over the coast right now, unaware that his wife was standing in his study, going through a safe. He'd apparently gone to real trouble to hide from her. I thought about the letter with my name on it, already opened, already read by someone who had just decided out loud that I wasn't allowed to know what was inside it. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, records spread across the screen, and made a decision I'd stand by through everything that came after I wasn't going home, and I wasn't confronting anyone until I understood exactly what I was looking at. Reyes's office opened at 9. I planned to be the first person through the door. I was outside Reyes's office before the lights were even on inside. When he unlocked the door and saw me standing there, something in his face told me he already suspected this wasn't a routine visit. I didn't ease into it. I told him what I'd seen on the camera feed, and I asked him directly whether there was a trust in my name tied to my mother's estate. He was quiet in the particular way lawyers go quiet when they're deciding how much they're allowed to say without a client's direct instruction. Then he confirmed it. Yes, my father had set it up years ago. But a few months back he said an amendment had been filed to change to the beneficiary structure. If it held up, Victoria would gain control over a significant share of those assets after my father's death. I asked him the only question that mattered. Did my father sign this? Yes, he said. For a moment, something in me went hollow. Every careful, disciplined thought I'd built up through a sleepless night collapsed under one plain fact: my father's own signature giving Victoria exactly what I'd watched her try to secure on that camera feed. It wasn't only anger at Victoria anymore. It was something colder aimed at my father. But Reyes wasn't finished. He pulled the file up and turned the screen toward me, then pulled a second record, an appointment log from a clinic 2 states away, dated the same day as the signature. My father had been there in person, according to the log, at the exact hour the amendment was supposedly signed at home. Victoria had told me weeks ago in passing that he'd spent that day resting at the house. If the clinic log was right, that wasn't true. I didn't want to leap to conclusions. Appointments get misfiled, dates get confused. I made myself consider it fairly, even as the steadier part of me understood it probably wasn't a clerical error. I asked Reyes if there was anything else. He hesitated, then told me my father had left a second set of instructions with the file months ago. Not a sealed letter waiting on some precise trigger, but a standing note asking Reyes to reach out to me directly if he ever noticed irregular activity around the trust, or if Victoria attempted to access documents without my father present. Reyes admitted a little uneasily that he'd been debating whether to call me for the past 2 days already, before I'd even walked in. That detail unsettled me more than a sealed envelope ever could have. My father hadn't set some clever trap waiting to spring at the perfect moment. He'd simply been afraid enough for long enough to leave a door open in case someone needed to walk through it before he could. Reyes handed me a letter my father had written and left with him, not locked behind any condition, just kept on file. I asked to read it alone. He stepped out, and I sat in that leather chair with the morning light coming in flat and gray through the blinds, and I opened it. Caroline, if you're reading this, I was afraid I wouldn't have the courage to tell you myself. I had to stop after that line. Not because I was overwhelmed, though I was, but because I needed a moment before I let my father's handwriting tell me whatever he'd been too afraid to say out loud for years. The letter went on to explain that his doubts about Victoria weren't new. They'd started small years ago, the way she asked about accounts, before she asked about anything else, the way her grief for me, secondhand and inherited, always seemed to sharpen around the subject of money. He'd told himself for a long time he was being unfair to her. A man, freshly widowed, sees threats everywhere he wrote because he's afraid of losing what's left. But the doubts never fully left him. They just went quiet, folded into the ordinary rhythm of a marriage he'd wanted badly to believe in. He admitted why he'd never told me directly. Not because he thought I couldn't handle it, because he was afraid that if I knew I'd force a confrontation immediately, and he wasn't ready to lose another person from his life so soon after losing my mother. Reading that line, something in my chest loosened slightly, some of the coldness from a moment ago giving way to something closer to grief. It wasn't an excuse, but it was at least a real reason, not a convenient one. My phone rang while I was still holding the letter. My father. "Caroline," he said, his voice tighter than I'd heard it in years. "Where are you?" "I'm at Reyes's office." I told him, deciding there was no more room left for half-truths between us. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Don't go back to the house." I told him I already knew why. I told him about the camera, about Elena's call, about the safe, and the letter with my name on it that Victoria had already opened and read before I ever had the chance. There was a long pause on the line, heavier than words. "I should have told you a long time ago," he finally said. "I kept telling myself I was protecting you. I think really I was just afraid of what it would mean to say it out loud. I didn't forgive him in that moment. I wasn't ready, and I told him so. But something in his voice, tired, finally honest, made room for the possibility that I might eventually once we'd finished dealing with what was actually in front of us. My father's plane had never actually left the ground. He told me that over the phone, and it took me a moment to understand what he meant. He said he'd been sitting at the gate, phone in hand, running through the same doubts that had been building in him for months, when something in his gut told him not to board. He wasn't trying to trap anyone. He wasn't clever enough, he said, to plan something like that on the spot. He'd simply looked at his boarding pass, thought about the safe code he'd changed months ago and never told Victoria about, and decided he wasn't ready to be 400 miles away not knowing what she'd do with an empty house and an unwatched week. So he texted me that everything was fine because he didn't want me worrying before he understood anything himself, and then he let Victoria board without him telling her his stomach was unsettled and he'd catch a later flight. He'd been sitting in a hotel near the airport ever since, waiting to see what would happen at a house he'd suddenly quietly decided not to leave unattended. I asked him why he hadn't called me the moment he made that decision. He was honest about it in a way that surprised me. "Because I still hoped I was wrong," he said. "I think some part of me needed to be wrong about her more than I needed to protect myself." I drove to the hotel that afternoon instead of going home. He looked older than I remembered from the airport that morning, tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel. He stood up when I walked in, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Some silences carry more than words can. He told me the rest without any of the careful editing that had shaped every conversation between us before this one. He'd known for months that something wasn't right. The safe code, the strange questions to Elena, small inconsistencies that had built quietly until he couldn't keep dismissing them. What he hadn't told me was that Victoria had also started managing more of his medical appointments, recently driving him to a specialist 2 states away, scheduling things without much explanation. He hadn't questioned it at the time. He'd been tired, and it had felt like care. Now laid next to everything else, it looked more like opportunity. I asked him carefully whether he remembered actually signing anything at that clinic visit. He said he remembered signing something Victoria had told him it was routine paperwork related to his care, and he'd been groggy from a procedure and hadn't read it as closely as he should have. My stomach turned at that. It wasn't proof of anything criminal, not yet, but it was proof that whatever amendment existed, it hadn't been signed with a clear understanding of what it actually was. "I was afraid," he admitted, "that if I told you what I suspected, you'd force me to choose between you and her right there before I had any real proof. And I wasn't ready to lose another person from this family so soon after your mother." I felt something rise in my throat that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It sat somewhere in between, the particular ache of understanding that someone loved you enough to lie to you, and that the lie had cost you 2 days of chasing shadows alone. He reached into a bag beside his chair and pulled out the wooden box, the one Victoria had taken from the safe, the one he'd given Elena for safekeeping a decade ago before it vanished. He must have retrieved it from her at some point that morning before I arrived. He held it out to me, and for a moment his hand wasn't entirely steady. "Not yet," I told him, gently closing his fingers back around it. "Let's finish this the right way first. Then I want to open it with you, not alone." He nodded, and something in his face eased slightly, like he'd been waiting years for someone to tell him that. We spent the rest of that afternoon at the hotel building what would actually hold up not accusations, not anger, but documentation. Reyes joined us by phone, and together we started assembling everything the clinic records, the security footage, the recorded audio from the safe, the discrepancy between what Victoria had told me and what had actually happened that week. My father agreed to have his own account of the signing reviewed by a doctor familiar with the medication he'd been on that day in case it mattered later. By evening, we had enough to stop reacting and start deciding on our own terms what came next. I still hadn't opened that wooden box. It sat between us on the small hotel table, and I found myself glancing at it more than once, wondering what my mother had wanted me to know badly enough to leave it behind a painting for 10 years. But some things deserve to be read without a legal battle hanging over them. This wasn't that moment yet. Soon, though, I could feel it getting close. Reyes called the next morning with something that changed the shape of everything I'd assumed about who Victoria was. He'd pulled records going back further than the trust amendment, curious about the man in the security footage. Mark Dalton, it turned out, wasn't a random hire. He'd represented Victoria years earlier before she ever met my father during a dispute over her first husband's estate. Her husband had died in an accident. Nothing about the death itself had ever been treated as suspicious. Reyes was careful to make that clear, and I was careful to hold on to that fact too, because it would have been easy in the state I was in to let my imagination run somewhere unfair. But after that death, Victoria had fought a long, bitter battle over the estate, contesting the will, questioning the beneficiaries her husband had chosen before he died. She'd lost most of it. Reyes said the case had left a mark on her financially, and from what he could piece together personally. I sat with that for a while. It didn't excuse anything she'd done, but it reframed her slightly in a way I hadn't expected to feel. She wasn't simply someone chasing money for its own sake. She was someone who had once lost everything through a legal system she didn't trust, and who had apparently decided somewhere along the way that she would never let that happen to her again, even if it meant becoming the kind of person who let herself into a house with a key she wasn't supposed to have. It didn't make me forgive her. It made her make sense, which was almost worse. My father called Dalton back into the story himself that afternoon, cornering him with a directness I hadn't seen from him in years. Dalton, it turned out, hadn't fully understood how far Victoria intended to take things. He'd helped her retrieve documents, believing or telling himself he believed that he was simply assisting a client protect what she was rightfully owed. When Reyes laid out the recorded call in which Victoria explicitly asked him to help secure control of the trust before my father could revise it, Dalton went quiet in a way that suggested even he understood how that would read to anyone outside the room. We arranged the meeting for the next day at Reyes's office rather than the house-neutral ground my father's request made in a voice steadier than I'd heard from him since this whole thing started. Victoria arrived expecting, I think, some kind of negotiation she could still manage her way through. She always had before. She wasn't composed the way she'd been in my imagination of this moment. When Reyes laid the security footage on the table, she denied it. First said she'd only gone back for something small. Misremembered why. When the audio played, catching her voice clearly this time, saying the words I hadn't been able to stop hearing for days, "She can't know about this." The denial shifted into something sharper. She turned to me directly, not my father, and said, "Your father chose me. I've spent 10 years taking care of things you weren't here for." "Maybe he did," I said. "But he didn't choose what you did behind his back." She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time since I'd known her, I watched Victoria go quiet in a way that wasn't strategy. It was the particular stillness of someone realizing the story they'd been telling themselves for years, no longer held together under the weight of what was actually on the table. Reyes delivered the last piece without theatrics, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. The amendment had never been properly executed, signed yes, but under circumstances a medical review would likely call into question and never filed correctly to begin with. Whatever Victoria had built her plan around it had never actually held the power she believed it did. I thought I'd feel triumphant hearing that. I didn't, not fully. I felt tired, and underneath the tired, something closer to grief for the version of my family I'd believed in without question for 10 years, one that had never quite existed the way I thought. Victoria didn't say much after that. She looked for just a moment less like the woman who'd walked into that house with a key and a plan, and more like someone who'd spent a decade so afraid of losing everything again that she'd become willing to lose it the right way instead. I didn't ask her to explain herself further. I'd stopped needing that. What I asked instead was the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the moment I first saw that black SUV in our driveway. Where is my father actually, not just physically? Where has he been this whole time while all of this was happening around him? Because some part of me understood sitting in that office that finding the truth about Victoria had only been half the story. The other half was still waiting for me back at that hotel in a conversation I hadn't finished having yet. We didn't leave Reyes's office with a scene. Victoria gathered her things quietly, and my father, to his credit, didn't raise his voice once, not because he'd forgiven her, but because he told me later. He'd already grieved that part of their marriage days earlier sitting alone in that hotel room, and there was nothing left in him to perform. What followed over the next week was slow and unglamorous the way real consequences usually are. Victoria's access to the accounts was formally revoked. The documents Reyes had gathered were handed over for proper review, the unauthorized entry, the circumstances around the signing, all of it moving now through channels that didn't need me standing in the room to keep pushing them forward. Dalton cooperated once he understood how exposed his own position had become. He claimed, and I believed him, that he hadn't fully grasped how far Victoria intended to take things. My father began rebuilding his estate plan from the ground up, and this time he insisted I be in the room for every page of it. No more decisions made on my behalf out of some misguided instinct to protect me from my own family. I didn't take anything from Victoria that wasn't already legally mine to begin with. I didn't push for anything beyond what the truth itself demanded. There's a version of this story where I stand somewhere and watch her lose everything and feel something like triumph. That isn't what it felt like once I actually got there. What I felt instead was closer to relief, the specific quiet relief of no longer having to wonder what was being hidden from me inside my own house. Victoria moved out within the month. I heard through channels I didn't go looking for that she'd taken a small apartment across town and was working with her own lawyer to sort out what came next for her. I didn't feel the need to know more than that. Whatever losses she carried into this marriage from her first one, whatever fear had driven her to become someone who let herself into a house with a key she wasn't supposed to use, none of that was mine to fix, and none of it excused what she'd done. But I found I didn't need to hate her to close that chapter. I just needed it closed. My father drove back with me the night everything at Reyes's office finally settled instead of returning to the hotel. Neither of us said much on the way. When we pulled into the driveway, the flag out front hung still in the evening air, and the house looked exactly the way it always had, which felt strange given everything that had moved through it over the past week. We went straight to the study. The painting was still leaning against the desk where it had been left, the safe standing open behind it, emptied now of everything except the space itself. My father and I stood there a moment without speaking, looking at that dark rectangle in the wall, like it was something that needed acknowledging before it could be closed again. The house was quiet around us, no hum of the air conditioning cycling on, no sound from the kitchen. Just the two of us and 10 years of things neither of us had said out loud until this week. Then together we lifted the painting back onto its hook. Neither of us spoke while we did it. It didn't need explaining. When it was straight, my father stepped back and looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something familiar after you've learned it was never quite what you thought it was. "There's still the box," he said quietly, not quite looking at me. I nodded. I wasn't ready yet, not standing in that room with the safe still gaping open behind the frame. "Not here," I told him. "Kitchen, like it should have been all along." He didn't argue. He just reached into his jacket where he'd been carrying it since the hotel and held it out to me, small, dark, with age lighter in his hands than I expected something so heavy with meaning to be. We walked out of the study together, leaving the painting behind us, finally hiding nothing. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast as a teenager before leaving for training all those years ago, and for a moment neither of us reached for the box. It just sat there between us, small and unremarkable, nothing about its plain wooden surface, hinting at what it had cost to finally get it back into this room. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single folded letter, the paper gone soft at the creases the way old paper does, and beneath it a few small things. A photograph I didn't recognize at first. A thin gold chain. A folded page of what looked like handwritten notes about the vacation property on the eastern shore. I set those aside for later and unfolded the letter first. "My dear Caroline, if you're reading this, you've already become stronger than I ever was." My hands weren't entirely steady holding that page, and I let them shake. There didn't seem to be any reason not to anymore. Not in this kitchen, not with my father sitting across from me, not with nothing left between us to perform composure for. She'd written more than I expected. Not instructions, not warnings about the future she couldn't have predicted anyway. Just a mother trying to leave something true behind for a daughter she wouldn't get to watch grow up. She wrote about the vacation house, why she'd wanted me to have it someday, the summer she imagined I might spend there with a family of my own. She wrote that she hoped I'd learn to trust my own judgment more than she'd ever fully trusted hers, and that whatever happened in this family after she was gone, she hoped I'd remember that loving people honestly mattered more than protecting them from hard truths, even when honesty was harder than silence. I read that last line twice. Then I looked up at my father, who had gone very still across the table, his eyes on the letter like he already knew what it said, or maybe like he was hearing it as fresh as I was. "She knew you'd do this," I said quietly. "Try to protect me by not telling me things." He didn't deny it. "She knew me better than I knew myself most days," he said. "I think that's why I could never quite let this box go all the way. Some part of me kept hoping if I held onto it long enough I wouldn't have to be the one who finally opened it." We sat with that for a while, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and faintly the sound of the flag outside catching in a small gust of evening wind. I picked up the photograph next, my mother, younger than I ever really remembered her, standing in front of a house I recognized from my father's notes as the one on the eastern shore, laughing at something outside the frame. I'd never seen this picture before. I wondered how many other pieces of her my father had been quietly protecting me from, not out of secrecy, but out of a grief he'd never fully learned how to share. "I never stopped being your dad," he said suddenly, like the words had been building in him since the hotel room, since the airport, maybe since the funeral 10 years ago. "I know it didn't always look like it. I told myself keeping things from you was protecting you. I think I just forgot somewhere along the way that protecting you was supposed to mean standing beside you in the hard things, not shielding you from ever having to face them." I didn't tell him everything was forgiven in that moment because it wasn't, not entirely, not yet. But I reached across the table and put my hand over his, and that was enough for both of us to understand where we actually stood. We didn't talk about Victoria again that night. There didn't seem to be anything left to say about her that the last week hadn't already said more clearly than words could. What we talked about instead was smaller and steadier, the house on the Eastern Shore, whether I might actually go see it sometime, whether my father wanted to come with me the first time I did. He said he did. I told him I'd like that. Before I left that night, I put my mother's letter back in the box gently, the way you'd put away something you intend to take back out again soon. I understood something sitting in that kitchen that I hadn't fully understood in the 2 days since Elena's first phone call. For years I'd thought revenge meant making someone pay for what they'd taken from you. I know now that's not quite right. Sometimes the strongest, most lasting form of justice is simpler than that. It's just refusing to let anyone else decide what the truth is allowed to be. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Leave it in the comments below. We've got new stories like this one waiting for you every day, so subscribe if you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going together.